Next year, legislative leaders are expected to begin restructuring the state's public school finance system. Their challenge is huge, but necessary, according to an analysis of the current funding system from the Locke Foundation's education expert, Dr. Terry Stoops. In his report, co-authored with Aaron Garth Smith of the Reason Foundation, Dr. Stoops lays out a plan for revamping the broken system. He joins us now. Terry, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
You write in your report that the current way that we fund public schools in North Carolina is unfair, outdated, complex. How so?
Well, it's complex in the sense that it takes, on average, a finance leader around 2 years to understand how it works. And if you think about the fact that we have a system that takes financial experts 2 years to learn the ins and outs, that should raise some alarms about the complexity of the system. But the way that it's set up in North Carolina, and it's difficult really to explain, you'd really have to see it in action to understand just how confusing it could be. Essentially, what the state does is they provide categories of funding for teachers, for school books, and for various other functions of the school. And they have formulas that establish how much each district would receive for each of these areas. There are rules that govern whether you can take money from one area and give it to another. There are some laws that prohibit moving money from one area to another. And so we have this complex system where money getting from the state to the districts is governed by all of these formulas and governed by all of these categories that are established for the system and what the system's needs are, mainly personnel.
You write a very interesting example in the report of what actually happens on the ground based on all those formulas that you're talking about. Tell us what happens when it comes to the classroom teacher allotment and how the determination is made of how many teachers a school receives.
Sure, and this is one that's tinkered with often. So the way that this works is that the state will give a district money based on the number of students in certain grades and the ratio of students to teachers. So, for example, one teacher for every 16 or 17 students. The school district would receive money for a teacher position. That the money that they receive is based on the average pay for the teachers in the district. So that's the money that they get for that position, regardless of how much it would cost to employ that teacher. And once that allotment gets to the county, they can do various things with it. Now, this raises the question, what if it turns out that you have less than one teacher per every 16 students in, say, second grade? What happens? Well, you're not going to get the allotment for that one teacher. You have to have it break down to having a certain number of students per teacher, and that means that the remainder would not get the teacher allotment that they may need.
So our listeners can tell, even by this conversation, that this really is like a web of formulas, of rules, and it's very, very complicated and complex. You write in your report that we really should not only modernize this, but we've got to make this a lot easier for people and give them much more flexibility, because you say a principal needs to be able to control these dollars and move dollars around and be able to allocate dollars to what is actually happening in that local district and in the schools. Give us a sense of your recommendations for policymakers. As I mentioned at the top of this interview, next year they are going to start really restructuring this.
Absolutely. And our recommendation is what's called backpack funding or student-based funding. And this is essentially looking at what the students' needs are and funding schools that way. So here's a perfect example. You have a student that's a special needs child in a low-income community. They would receive a base dollar amount that every student in the state would receive. And then there would be additional amounts added to that base amount based on the fact that they're a special needs student and they're a low income student. And you would basically build the funding system based on the demographics and the needs of the student rather than the system like it's currently structured. This is a recommendation that would do a couple things for the state. First, I think it would give some fairness to the system that we have in place now. It would definitely be more fair. It would give some autonomy to those teachers and principals and superintendents that run school districts. It would be transparent. It would be very apparent how much a school or a district gets based on the students that they have. But I think that the best feature of this system is that in the future it can be portable. And so if the funding is based on the student, it could also be attached to the student. And when you attach the funding to the student, the next step is to give parents the power to be able to determine where that money goes. And that's the system that I would hope that one day that North Carolina would go to. We're a long way from that. We have a lot of work to do to fix the system that's been in place for decades, the confusing, complex system that only a few people really, truly understand in the state. But I feel confident that the Republicans in the General Assembly are going to move forward in some of the initial proposals that they have had for reforming the system.
Are there any other states that are moving towards this student-centered, student-weighted approach?
Absolutely. You look at states like Hawaii and Texas really have great systems set up for determining how that funding is allocated. But the state that I like to talk about is California, because as we know, California does very little right. I mean, California is not a state known for having good policy, but they got their student funding system right, and it wasn't easy for them to get to that point. Of course, it required an increase in funding. But they have a really great student-based funding system. And so we have examples around the nation. We have states that are using this right now. We can learn from their experiences with this system, take the best features of what's out there, and incorporate that into what's happening in North Carolina. And I think that there's an appetite, a bipartisan appetite, to do that here in our state.
I'm so glad you used the word bipartisan, because just mentioning the three states that you did here, we're talking about California, obviously very blue state, Hawaii, a blue state, Texas, a red state. So really, this does cross political lines here to do this.
Absolutely. And it should be noted that this whole effort to look at the funding system and to consider ways to reform it was a Democratic proposal. In 2009, when the Democrats had control of the General Assembly, they commissioned a report to look at North Carolina's school funding model and to consider alternatives. They received the report in 2010, and unfortunately, that's the year when the Great Recession started, so it became difficult to implement really any kind of changes. But it was a bipartisan effort then, and fortunately, we had Republicans in the General Assembly like Craig Horn who were mindful of that report and thinking about ways to incorporate that when we have a budget that's stable like we currently have, and thinking about ways to use what that report told us and what a later report from the North Carolina Program Evaluation Division report told us should be done in North Carolina and could be done to improve our current system.